All right, some of you may be familiar with the historian Lynn White, who wrote a famous paper back in my day, The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. Some people remember that. Old-timers? Anybody? All right, yeah, all right, some of us remember this because we had to read it when we were young, but Lynn White arguably started a lot of current concerns about the environment in the 1960s when he pointed out that there are some immortality ideologies that are fundamentally hostile to nature, whether they're intended to be or not. And this was a very controversial paper, but he just said, you know, I think one thing that we ought to be willing to ponder is that the Judeo-Christian tradition, in an unintended fashion, creates antagonistic or imperialistic attitudes towards nature. English translation, all that White said is that if we remember what we learned in Sunday school from the book of Genesis, that God created everything, and I can't remember if it was Monday or Tuesday when he got around to making all the animals and all of the fishes and all of the birds. And then a day or two later, he creates humans in his own image. And therein starts our difficulties, because here's a distinction between us and the rest of the animate world. Everything else is created out of dust. We've got dust, but we're godly dust, so we're created in a divine image. And we are given dominion over all of the creatures. And what Lynn White proposes, remember that we're given dominion over all that flies, over all that crawls, over all that walks. And basically what White speculates is that that fosters a cavalierly, condescending and patronizing attitude towards nature, which we treat as one giant buffet table to avail ourselves of at our discretion. No, I'm not defending that proposition as a comprehensive explanation of why people have a tough time engaging with nature in a benign or friendly way, but I think it's worthy of our consideration. Just this idea that a psychological need to find ourselves better than and different than nature may have something to do with this. And along those lines, I think very clearly part of this is that we have a hard time with accepting the fact that we're animals. And in some of our research, for example, when we remind people of their mortality, they are particularly resistant to acknowledging that they have anything to do with their fellow creatures. So I think part of this might be understood as just efforts to distance ourselves from nature, because after all, that which is natural is of finite duration. Becker would argue, I suppose, that that was the psychological impetus for the construction of supernature, right? If nature was not so finite, I would be fine with it as long as I was here forever. In other words, it is only by the construction of a supernatural universe that we can transcend the normal confines of time and space and potentially live forever. Well, another aspect, though, of the denigration of nature is, I think, something that Merlin must have talked about yesterday, I think, just judging from your email, and that's just the idea that nature, for a lot of folks, myself included, has deadly connotations. It's dangerous, it's unpredictable, it's uncontrollable, and consequently for most people, particularly those like me who grew up in the Bronx, trees and stuff make me nervous. They're not symmetrical, and there's no vending machines. Like, I was in the Everglades when I was a kid, and I'll never forget this. I'm like, well, kid, I was in college, and we're in the Everglades, and we're on one of those pontoon boats where you run through the Everglades. And my Aunt Rose I have all my relatives. It was a bad situation. But anyway, every Jewish person in the Bronx now moved to Florida on the boat in the Everglades. I'm like, this is so beautiful. The tears are streaming down my face. And my Aunt Rose is like, ugh, Someone should put up a Kmart here. What? This is such a waste of a commercial opportunity. All right, so nature, nature evokes images of death. And sure enough, this claim has been empirically corroborated by two very clever psychologists, Sander Kool and Agnes Vandenberg, in 2005. They're Dutch psychologists. And they did some studies with Dutch city dwellers. So these are residents of Amsterdam. And the first thing that they did, very simple, but I think very interesting, they just asked the people how often they thought about various topics like art, family, politics, music, death. They had like 10 of them. And then, but the little twist was they asked some of them, how much do you think about these things when you're in Amsterdam? And they asked other people, how much do you think about these things when you're in like a meadow or a garden, cultivated nature, they called it. And then they asked people, well, how much do you think about these things if you're in a forest, just something that's totally untouched by human hands? And what they found is that when they asked people, what are you apt to think about when you're in a city or in a garden, death did not come up prominently. But on the other hand, when folks were asked, what do you think about when you think about being in a rainforest? Then intimations of mortality came to mind more readily. More convincing, though, is another study they did where they asked people to either think about death or think about something unpleasant, and then they just showed them Dutch landscapes, some of which were cultivated, like meadows that had been mowed in like orderly, symmetrical rows, and some were totally wild. They didn't label them as such, so there were either cultivated landscapes or just raw nature. And what they found, I think, is profoundly interesting, and that is that when people were reminded of their mortality, they liked cultivated landscapes more, and they liked raw nature considerably less. All right, the suggestion here is that nature is not to our liking unless we can sculpt it in our image. English professors Norbert Fry, The Motive for Metaphor, where he talks about how nature in its raw form is exceptionally discombobulating. We need to lend it human form in order to be comfortable with it. All right, so that's the denigration of nature thing. Let's switch gears quickly and just go to death-denying materialism, the other plank of Janice's paper where she says, look, there's two things going on. One is that money has served as a symbolic immortality token from time immemorial. This is a story for another time. But as Becker points out in a lovely chapter about money as the new immortality ideology and escape from evil, people tend to think of money as just a rational medium of exchange that people use in order to trade goods and services. It is surely that, but it always has been even more than that. So according to Becker, drawing from Norman O. Brown and like-minded theorists, money and stuff has always served to fortify a sense that we might live forever. So on the one hand, you got money, and commodities has always served as a symbolic psychological balm. And then on top of that is just the idea that in America, we have raised that to a way of life. So money is a symbolic immortality object in general, but in the United States in the 20th and 21st century, it's become more than that. It is literally the focus upon which our days revolve. Anyway, I like, who knows Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, one of my favorite plays, where Big Daddy says the human animal is a beast that dies, and if he's got money, he buys and buys and buys. And I think the reason he buys everything he can buy is that in the back of his mind, he has the crazy hope that one of his purchases will be life everlasting. And I think that really sums it up, just this idea that you can buy your way into perpetuity. Of course, many of you remember in the aftermath of September 11th, 2001, when President Bush was asked, what should Americans do? What did he say? Go shopping. So on the one hand, we're already psychologically prepared to embrace rabid consumerism and endless acquisition of large piles of money in order to perpetuate ourselves over time symbolically. But that's also encouraged by the fact that our cultural worldview is based on measuring ourselves in terms of the magnitude of our bank accounts and the number of tchotchkes that sit on our shelves. All right, so what? Well, back to the empirical end of things, and here I'm going to add a few things to Janice's very nice summary of what was around at the time. But even since she wrote her paper, there's now a boatload of empirical work in accord with that proposition. And I'm not going to cite these folks, but if you are interested, I'll send you these papers, just because these names will not be familiar to you. But anyway, recent paper has shown that death anxiety and low self-esteem, high death anxiety, low self-esteem are highly correlated with materialism. So in a correlational study at a business school, they just measured death anxiety, self-esteem, and how materialistic people are. And sure enough, highly materialistic people tended to be those who had high death anxiety and low self-esteem. And does it make sense, because this is as close as I have to a technical point today, that that's very much in accord with what Becker would predict? If materialism is to assuage concerns about mortality, then indeed people who are most materialistic should be the ones who are most insecure and profoundly concerned about their mortality. I'm not convinced by that, though, because in my world, correlation just means that there's a relationship. Epistemologically, that doesn't pay the rent. You have to show that there's a causal connection. So I'm more persuaded by work that actually manipulates death reminders. And so another study done in about year 2001 by some folks that we know, borrowing our mortality salience paradigm. They had some folks think about dying. They had other folks think about something unpleasant. And then in one study, they just asked them, how much money do you expect to have in 15 years? And what are you going to spend your money on? Are you going to buy a house? Are you going to read books? Are you going to go on vacation, buy fancy clothes, and entertain yourself? And they found two things. One is that reminders of mortality increased estimates of fiscal acquisition. English translation, people who thought about dying estimated that they were going to have more money. Secondly, and perhaps more tellingly, what they said was they were going to spend it on leisure and status-related items. So not only were they going to have more money, but they weren't going to use it for benevolent or arguably utilitarian purposes. They said they were going to buy clothes, go on vacation, get the 6-foot by 12-foot TV screen, and so on and so forth. I think that's important because it highlights that the impetus for the acquisition of stuff has little or nothing to do with utility. It's about status per se. And that notion was buttressed by another study that I love the title, He Who Dies with the Most Toys Wins, by a guy named Steve Heine at the University of British Columbia. Some people think about death, some people think about something else, and then they think this was done in a business school. They think they're in a study of marketing research, and they show them a can of Pringles and a Lexus and a Chevy Metro and a Rolex. And they're like, hey, we just want you to rate these items and how much you'd like to have them. And what they found is that death reminders increased affection only for high status stuff. So people wanted a Lexus and a Rolex more, but they didn't care much for the potato chips or the Chevy. So the point is that death reminders do not result in indiscriminate affection for anything. They result in a zeal to acquire objects that have a whiff of status, and hence I would argue the prospect of immortality.